Would you like to reimagine what's widely considered the largest battle in human history? Are you looking for an engaging version of Axis and Allies that you can finish in an afternoon? Well, then you've come to the right place. Get ready for the battlefield basics for the all-new Axis and Allies Stalingrad from Renegade Game Studios. Grab your babushka, turn up your collar, and get your battle plans ready. We're heading to Stalingrad. Let's make it hot. Welcome to Board Game Nation. My name is Gary Blevins. Thank you so much for watching. And a big thank you to our friends at Renegade Game Studios for sponsoring today's video. Follow the link in the description to see where you can get your copy of not just this great game, but the whole catalog of Axis and Allies games, accessories, and so much more. Axis and Allies Stalingrad is a two-player game that allows you to take command of the Axis or Soviet forces in this crucial turning point of World War II, and today we're going to get you ready for action. As we go, you'll find a little graphic that pops up like this one with the relevant page number in the rulebook for the section that we're talking about in case you've got questions later. You can also use the chapter guides to jump around as needed. Oh, and Russian is not my first language or my second or third language. I don't speak Russian. So I apologize in advance for any butchered mispronunciations. I promised my best efforts, but there is no way I'm going to get all these names right every time. Perelazovsky? Perelazovsky. Bread Factory. Bread Factory. I got that one. I got that. Moving on. Axis and Allies Stalingrad features two very different scenarios. The Race for Stalingrad is the full battle experience starting the game on August 21st, 1942. This scenario plays in 13 rounds and should take 4 to 5 hours. Operation Uranus starts just as winter sets in on November 19th, 1942. This scenario is 7 rounds long and should play in right around 3 hours. A quick note for longtime fans of the Axis and Allies franchise. Stalingrad borrows heavily from the mechanics of Axis and Allies D-Day. Single-round combat, contested zones, order cards, and stacking limits are just a few examples, meaning that if you've played D-Day, this is going to feel familiar, but there are several differences, so hang in there. The Battle of Stalingrad was fought in the area surrounding the city and in the city proper. These two different operating theaters are represented by two separate maps. On the left is the region board. On this map, you'll notice a box around the city of Stalingrad. This is a blow-up box that contains the city board. These two maps are best placed next to each other like this, but they can be arranged in whatever way makes the most sense for your table. Just be aware that units are going to be moving back and forth between them using the zone names on the city map. Some zones on both maps have a circled number in them. These are reinforcement point zones, or RP zones for short. Controlling these at the proper time will provide players with reinforcement point certificates that they can use to, well, purchase reinforcements. Here's how this game is won. A victory can be deemed total, major, or minor. If the terms are met, a total victory can be declared at the end of any round of play. The Axis can claim total victory by controlling all RP zones on the city map and maintaining a supply line into at least one of them. The Allies can declare a total victory if they control or contest all zones west of the Don River, plus Potomac, Renok, and Viertiachi. If neither side has accomplished these goals by the end of the 13th round, the Axis may claim a major victory if they control at least one RP zone on the city board and maintain a supply line into that zone. The Allies can call it a major victory if they control all 6 fortified zones on the city board, Potomac, Renok, and Viertiachi. If no one can declare a total or major victory at the end of the game, the side who controls Potomac achieves a minor victory. Time to prepare for battle. First, choose the scenario you wish to play. The 13-round campaign of Race to Stalingrad or the 7-round counteroffensive of Operation Uranus. When that's decided, place the two boards side by side, place the order cards on the region map, and place the Operation Uranus cards near the Soviet player. Give each player a unit reference chart. These are double-sided with the Axis on one side, the Allies on the other. The game also comes with cards laying out some fun optional rules, but I recommend leaving these in the box for the first few games, or at least until you have a good handle on all the rules and some strategic lines. When that's done, but before placing units belonging to any specific power, head over to page 9 of the rulebook for the step-by-step setup instructions that are specific to the scenario that you've selected. When you've completed that process and you've got everything in the right place, give each player their setup charts. Now, these are also double-sided, so make sure that both players are using the side with the scenario that everyone has agreed to play. Yes, I made that mistake. I'll admit that on my first attempt, the setup charts tripped me up a little bit, and not just because I was using the wrong side, but once you understand how they work, they make perfect sense. Rather than listing all the zones on their own line like we've seen in other A&A games, The setup charts in Stalingrad show zones in a list that all have the same starting pieces in them. So in the Operation Uranus scenario, Rhinoc is the only zone that starts with 2 mechanized infantry, 1 artillery, 1 assault gun, and 1 control marker. While the zones of Bolshoi, Kletskaya, Abgenerovo Station each start with 3 minor Axis infantry and 1 control marker. Oh, and the yellow pieces are the minor Axis units. And by the way, all zones are Soviet controlled by default. So if a zone doesn't have a German or Axis control marker in it, it's Soviet controlled. The reference charts have silhouettes of all of the units, but at first glance, the actual pieces representing the assault gun, aka STuG III, can be a little hard to differentiate from the Panzer tanks. Here's a hint. The Panzers are a little bigger overall, and their turret is curved along the back, while the assault gun is a little shorter, a little smaller, and the turret is much more squared off. I want you to look for that. It shouldn't be a problem. A few other components to know about. Combat markers are used to show the location of active battles, and yes, you will be placing these during the setup process. Combat markers are double-sided. One side says battle, the other assault. During setup, any combat markers placed should be battle side up. One unsupplied marker will be going on the map during setup. The unlucky owner of that marker will depend on the scenario. These are also double-sided with a power on each side. The supply tokens will be placed during setup, but these can change hands over the course of the game, so these are also double-sided. The game does come with paper reinforcement point certificates that you can use for tracking income. These are cool, but you can also use a pen and paper if you'd prefer. To help keep the board clean and the action easier to manage, the game comes with gray and green stacking chips. For clarity, each mini is 1 unit. A gray chip under a unit represents 1 additional unit of the same type, and a green chip represents 3 additional units of the same type. So a guy on the map is just 1 guy. A guy with a gray chip under him equals 2 guys. A guy with a green chip is 4 guys. You get it. However, and this is super important, the number of game pieces in a player's inventory or in the shared inventory is strictly limited to the number of physical pieces that come with the game. For reference, these are also listed on page 5 of the rulebook. So the Germans can have big stacks of mechanized infantry if they want to, but they can never be in more than 6 different zones on the board at the same time. Even the green and gray stacking chips themselves are limited to the actual number of components that came in the box. As a result, the total number of units available to everyone is limited by this combination of minis and chips. That also means that you're going to want to keep this game intact. No mixing pieces or chips from other games into this box. Here is some good news though. Whenever a piece or a token is removed from play for any reason, it just returns to the player's inventory or shared inventory as appropriate. So after just a few minutes of following those steps on page 9 and using the setup chart, you should be able to go from this to this.
Ooh. Ah.
Before we start the game, let's look at these maps a little bit more closely. They're made up of zones that are separated by border lines and rivers. Some of these zones have reinforcement point values of 1 or 2, but most do not. This is the Battle of Stalingrad after all, so don't expect a ton of reinforcements and supplies to constantly be pouring into the area. All zones exist in 2 sets of conditions relative to each side. Now this is going to sound a little simple, but it's really important to keep these straight. They're either contested or uncontested, and either friendly or hostile. Contested zones contain combat markers, and uncontested zones do not. Friendly zones are controlled by you, hostile zones are controlled by an enemy. Note that friendly zones are still considered friendly even if they're contested. That's going to be really important. Hang on to that. Surednaya, Aktuba, and Tutsinskaya are both base zones. In classic playground style, these base zones can never be captured. They are safe. These are actually much further away than indicated on the map, so they'll never be entered by enemy units. Only friendly air units and supply tokens may enter a base zone. There are a limited number of airfields in this game, and they are already on the map. Air units can only land in zones with airfields, and each airfield can only hold up to 4 air units. The Don and Volga rivers act as border lines. Units can cross the Don River anywhere, but attacking across it may be riskier. The Volga River is larger, and zones on opposite side of it are not considered to be adjacent for the purposes of land movement. However, on the city board, Soviet land units and supply tokens are able to cross it east to west via ferries or ice bridges. Axis land units can never cross the Volga River. One last thing before we get into the action, we need to talk about supply lines. They are a big part of this game, and understanding how they work is going to be critical. First, these red spiderwebs are road and rail lines. These allow certain land units to move farther than normal, but these are not border lines. They don't break up a zone. Oh, and I think they look like railroads, so you might hear me call them that. All of your land units are always either supplied or unsupplied. If they're unsupplied, place one of these tokens in the zone with your guys with the appropriate side face up. These units will still be able to move, attack, etc., but they'll suffer penalties during combat. Good news though, your air units are always supplied, so you've got that going for you. So how do we determine if your land units have access to the beans and bullets that they're going to need? The region map has 11 zones with these railroad lines that run to the edge of the map. These are cleverly named supply line exit zones. SLEZs. No, that doesn't work. The Axis start with control of 6 of these exit zones on the south and the west sides of the map. The Soviets control the other 5, and theirs are on the north and the east sides of the map. The non-base exit zones can be captured by enemy forces, but these zones will only ever supply land units of the side of the original controller. Note that Dubovka and Abganerovo Station are the only exit zones without these little arrows on them. These exit zones will still only provide supplies to their respective powers. The arrows that are there are for something that we'll talk about later. For land units to be considered supplied, they don't need to be directly on a railroad track. Instead, they must be able to trace a line of friendly zones from their location to a supply line exit zone. This series of adjacent zones don't all have to be on the railroad line, and they don't even have to be occupied. They just have to be controlled, and they have to reach a supply line exit zone that is also under their control. Friendly zones along the way can also be contested, but they need to be controlled by the same side that needs the supplies. The city board also has railroad lines leaving the map, but these are not supply line exit zones. They do not automatically provide supplies like they do on the region map. To be supplied in the city, forces need to be able to trace a supply line off of the city board and then continue it to a supply line exit zone on the region board. So, for example, the Germans control a supply line that exits the city in Orlovka, and it exits to Viertiachi. But that doesn't help them. That doesn't do them any good because they don't control Viertiachi. They're also in control of the zones on the west side of the river where the ferries and later ice bridges will provide supplies. That doesn't help them either. The Axis can never draw supplies from across the Volga River. But they do control the leather factory, which connects to Potomnik. From there, they have a path of friendly zones to Verkhnekhamsky. So the leather factory can act as part of a supply line for any adjacent German units. Units on the region map may be able to build a path of supply lines that can be traced through the Stalingrad breakout box to an exit zone on the other side with 2 caveats. The supply lines heading east across the Volga can't be used to provide supplies to units on the region map and can never be used by the Axis. To successfully trace supply line through the city, the line actually has to have a path through the city. It's not automatic. This will be easier with an example. Now, I am almost certain it would be completely impossible for this situation to exist in a real game. This is purely for demonstration purposes, but if you want to pause and look around, all of the individual pieces are in legal positions and all the markers are in the right place if you've got questions about it later. Okay, here, clearly everything has gone horribly wrong for the Soviets. The Germans control almost every path for supplies in and out of Stalingrad. The Soviets in Potomnik are hanging on for dear life, and they are in need of supplies. They don't have a viable path on the region map, so they'll need to try to draw supplies through the city and up to the Dubovka supply line exit zone. To do that, they'll need to control enough zones in the city to make a path for those supplies to follow. And miraculously, they find one. Notice that this path goes through a number of zones with no Soviet units or rail lines, and some are currently contested. That's fine. The zones are all adjacent, and they are controlled by the Soviets. Now, it's important to know that units may trace a supply line out of a hostile zone in any direction. This means that an unsupplied force becomes supplied when it attacks a hostile zone that's adjacent to a friendly zone that is supplied. So, same basic example, but this time the heel is on the other route. The Germans of Viertiachi want to attack Potomnik, but they're the ones on the lookout for a supply line. The Soviets control nearly everything around them except for Beketovka, which is connected to the German supply line exit zone Abganerovo Station. So, because the units can also trace a supply line out of a hostile zone in any direction, when the Germans assault Potomnik, they'll be able to access supplies through Beketovka and, by extension, Abganerovo Station. If the Soviets in the city can't find a supply line that goes through the region map, they still might be able to get supplies from across the Volga River. The red dash lines crossing the river represent broken supply lines, so no joy there. Here's where the ferries and ice bridges come into play. You'll notice that these have completed red lines on them. Now, obviously, ferries and ice bridges can never carry as many supplies as a railroad, so they can only supply a limited area. The city map is broken into 3 colors. Ferries and bridges can supply Soviet forces in their respective sectors when their river crossing is in place. However, a completed crossing doesn't automatically supply all the zones in that respective sector. Allied forces must still be able to trace a path to the crossing in that same sector to be supplied, though that path may exit and re-enter the sector, or even exit the board itself and come back on. If the Axis take control of a landing zone for a ferry or ice bridge crossing, Soviet units attacking that zone from adjacent zones or coming across the river can draw supplies from the supply line that crosses the river. However, those supplies can't go beyond the enemy-controlled zone. One more quick example to help demonstrate how this works. Here, the Axis control Barricada Factory, which is the landing zone for the Gray Ferry. Unfortunately for them, they don't have a supply line from the region map that can reach that zone, and of course, they can't draw supplies from across the river, so they are unsupplied. The Soviets are attacking the zone with units from the tractor factory and an infantry offloading from the ferry. Now, because the Gray Ferry is intact, the Soviet units in Barricada Factory are considered supplied. However, Barricada Factory is still controlled by the Axis, meaning the Soviet supply line may not be drawn beyond that zone. As a result, and because they don't have another path for supplies, the Soviet units in the tractor factory and the bread factory are unsupplied. If the worst occurs for either side and all of their units in the city of Stalingrad have become completely cut off from supplies, you don't have to put a marker in every zone with guys in it. You can just place one unsupplied marker with the right side up on the region map to clearly demonstrate the desperation of the situation of the side that's been cut off. Supply tokens can be used to supply an attacking or defending land force when they are in the same zone as the supply token they control. If that force can trace a path through friendly zones to a zone containing a supply token that is owned by their side, or, and this is a departure from the regular supply line rules, if that supply token is in any adjacent zone. So again, if supply token is in a zone that is adjacent to units in need, that supply token can be tapped regardless of the friendly or hostile status of either zone. Supply tokens in base zones or on the other side of the Volga River cannot be accessed. Land units with a clear path to a supply token they control may spend 1 token to supply all friendly units in a single zone for 1 combat phase. Not an entire round, not all over the map, just 1 combat in 1 zone. Players are not required to spend a supply token. They can choose to have their otherwise unsupplied units fight unsupplied. More on what fighting unsupplied means when we get to combat in just a minute. When a supply token is spent by either side, remove it from the map and place it in the Soviets' supply token pool. Now, the Axis were given a set number of supply tokens during setup. The only way that they can gain access to supply tokens beyond their original allotment is by capturing them from the Allies. Enemy-owned supply tokens are captured when you take control of the zone that they are in. When captured, flip them over to show the new owner's emblem. One last thing about supply tokens. They can never move on their own. They only move on ferries or ice bridges or via air transport, a super handy bomber ability that we're going to talk about in a minute. All right, let's get this game underway. We're going to start with the Race to Stalingrad setup to cover the basics, but we're going to jump around a bit to demonstrate how the Operation Uranus cards and the specialty units work. Here we go. Each round follows a sequence of phases laid out on 14 order cards. But not all of them are used every round, and some are removed after use. Card number 1 is a good example. Here, players will check to see if a winter storm rolls in. The Race for Stalingrad scenario starts in August, so no need to roll for winter storms until round 6. Stuff like that. Still, we're going to use these cards to help explain the game, and we'll cover those little tiny things as we go. Let's get into it. Card number 1. Weather roll. As I just said, this isn't used until round 6, and the round tracker on the bottom of the board will show you what needs to be rolled to tell you whether or not Old Man Winter has entered the chat. Whenever bad weather occurs, place a frozen marker on the round track in the current round's space. The first time bad weather occurs, the Don River freezes. Place a frozen marker somewhere on the upper Don River as a reminder. The second time bad weather occurs, the Volga River freezes. Place any of the 3 ferries that are already not in position on the city board and then flip them over to show the ice bridge side. Bad weather also has effects on air units, but we'll cover that in a minute. Card number 2, Axis Reinforcements. This is the first of several order cards that will be specific to one side. Here, the Axis powers will collect RPs equal to the RP value of all of the zones that they both control and occupy. That's right, the Axis must have at least one land unit in an RP zone to collect that revenue. The Axis will deploy one free supply token or units depending on the round. The Axis may not spend any of their RPCs until the Operation Winter Storm round begins. More on that when we get there. Card number 3, Axis Movement. This feels like the right time to talk about movement in this game. Now, for my experienced Axis and Allies players, most of this is going to be somewhat familiar, but there are some key differences, so stick around. Let's turn to our trusty dusty player reference charts. Again, these are double-sided, Axis on one side, Allies on the other. And while they are similar, they are not the same. Both sides have supply tokens, infantry, mechanized infantry, artillery, tanks, fighters, and bombers. The Allies also have those ferry tokens and rocket launchers. Yeah. The Axis have the assault gun, and the infantry for minor Axis powers are called out separately. A little pro tip here. I know the assault guns look like tanks. Tanks and assault guns in this game have very different abilities, so try avoiding calling assault guns tanks while you're playing. It's just going to confuse everyone, mostly yourself. Instead, try referring to them as assault guns or by the historical name STuGs. Trust me on this. This next bit might be the biggest difference between Stalingrad and the mainline Axis and Allies games. Each side will only move their land units once per turn and only when directed to do so by the order cards. So card 3 says Axis units move. Now, the Axis can move all, some, or none of their units that are not in contested zones. That's right, once a land unit is involved in combat, it's do or die. There is no retreat. Okay, there's a lot of information on this player reference chart, and you're going to want to keep it handy throughout the game, but for now, we're only interested in the column labeled Move. You can see the movement value for all of the units. Basically, land units without an engine can move 1, and land units with an engine can move 2. When a land unit crosses into an adjacent zone via a borderline or across the Don River, it must spend 1 movement point. Now, air units have no limit on their movement capabilities. The combat area just isn't that big. So when they move, they aren't moving through anywhere. You can just place them wherever they're going. But there are some restrictions about where and when they can attack. Ferries don't move at all, and we'll talk about how supplies move later. A tank can blitz by moving through an unoccupied hostile zone as the first part of a 2-zone move that can end in a friendly or hostile zone. The tank immediately assaults and takes control of the unoccupied first zone before it moves into the next zone. The second zone can be friendly or hostile, or it can even go back to the zone that it came from. In addition, 1 mechanized infantry can move along with each blitzing tank. Now, despite having wheels and an engine, rocket launchers and assault guns do not have this ability, nor do they have road movement. Again, do not call assault guns tanks. It will only serve to confuse you. If a mechanized infantry or tank starts its movement in a zone with a road/rail line, and it follows a contiguous road for the entire move, it can move up to 2 additional zones. The move from beginning to end must follow a red line that connects zone to zone and has to follow the normal rules for movement. This means that a unit can get to a corner at an intersection and turn, but it can't switch roads by crossing through the middle of a zone to jump onto a new road. Blitzing and road movement cannot be combined. A tank cruising the byways of the Soviet countryside can't pick up 4 zones in the same turn. They can use road movement to get to a fight that's 4 zones away, but blitzing is only good for 2 moves, and road movement doesn't extend that ability. Basically, you can't use both abilities with the same tank on the same turn. So what happens when they run into an enemy unit? If 1 or more units move into a hostile zone that was not already contested, they begin an assault, even if that zone was not occupied. Place a combat marker in that zone with the assault side facing up. This is now a combat situation. Again, make sure that the assault side faces up on a brand new battle. This is going to matter in a minute. Okay, now that we've got that sorted, back to card number 3. So the Axis have moved their guys as they see fit. Also on this card is the short but very important step: check Axis stacking limits. At the end of each side's movement phase, check the number of land units belonging to them in each zone that they occupy to see if it exceeds 8. For each zone where it does, their opponent must move land units of their choosing out of the zone one at a time until the stacking limit is satisfied. Now, these have to be legal moves into adjacent zones that are not already at their stacking limits. If there are any excess units that cannot be legally moved out of the zone, then the controlling player must destroy land units of their choosing until the stacking limits are satisfied. Note that air units never count towards stacking limits. We're going to get to combat in a minute, but now that you understand a little bit more about the order of operation, a quick rules/strategy note here. The active player's units move, then you check for stacking limits, all before conducting combat. That means that you'll never be able to attack a zone with more than 8 land units. You might be able to attack with more units if you bring in air units, but no battle should ever have more than 8 attacking land units. Basically, that means that this is not a game of clashing stacks. Instead, to be successful here, you're going to have to pick your targets carefully and use the terrain wisely to secure the best possible outcome. Here's a fun picadillo in the rules that I really like. German mechs and infantry, and only German mechs and infantry, have an ability called Force Multiplier. This is a way to show the difference in scale between the two maps, and exactly how strong the German forces were in this fight. When either one of those two units moves from the region board to the city board by any means, they immediately add a German infantry to whatever zone on the city map that they've moved to. Pretty cool. However, if they try to leave the city and return to the region map, a single unit can't move out by itself. They've got to hold hands with a buddy as they go. German infantry and mechs must be accompanied by an infantry or a mech as they leave. Again, this is only a German thing. This doesn't apply to the Soviets or to the minor Axis units. As we mentioned, air units have unlimited range and they don't really pass through zones. They just get where they're going, fade any artillery fire, and then do what they came to do. So what options do these brave pilots have? This will literally depend on the weather and what they're flying. If the weather is clear, fighters have the following options. They can stay at their airbase and basically do nothing. They can move into a hostile zone and join or start a battle. Or they can relocate, which is to simply move to a different airbase that is in a friendly and uncontested zone. If the weather is bad, fighters become pretty well useless. They can't attack or defend, but they can be taken as casualties if they're on an airbase where combat is taking place. Fighters can relocate to another base in bad weather, but remember, each airbase can only hold up to 4 air units of any type. Bombers have some very cool abilities in this game. Again, starting with the fair winds and clear skies options, bombers can stay put, relocate, attack, or act as air transport. Holding position and relocating work the same as they did for fighters. However, attacking, not so much. Bombers are powerful weapons that shine when they don't have to worry about dropping bombs on their buddies. So to avoid friendly fire casualties, bombers cannot move into a contested zone to attack unless the zone is being assaulted. Remember earlier when I told you to make sure that the assault side of the battle marker was face up on newly created battle zones? This was why. The bombers are rolling in just ahead of the rest of their units. Not enough to make this a first strike attack, but enough to not mistakenly blast their buddies. If the battle goes more than one round, the token will be flipped to the side that says battle. At that point, the two fighting forces are too close together for bombers, meaning that the bombers will not be able to attack those zones. Which takes us to the bombers' ever-handy air transport ability. They can pick up cargo from a zone that they start in and move with it to another zone. Bombers can load up 1 infantry and move with them into a zone that is friendly, uncontested, and has an airfield. These are not paratroopers. They can't drop into hostile or enemy-occupied zones. 3 quick things. Infantry cannot be air transported to a base zone. They cannot be airlifted from the city board to the region board, and the bomber's move with the infantry is its full move. It can't move again this turn. Bombers can deliver supplies in 2 different ways. They can land up to 2 supply tokens in any friendly zone with an airfield, whether that zone is contested or not. Lastly, bombers can do a supply drop. They can drop 1 supply token into any contested or friendly zone. This is a great way to get supplies to land units that have become separated from their supply lines, assuming that the bombers avoid the air defenses. If the weather's officially bad, though, bombers can still relocate and perform all of their original transport abilities, but like fighters, they can't attack or defend. We need to talk about the crossing of the Volga River and the perils thereof. Soviet land units and supplies can cross the Volga River from Krasnaya Sloboda on ferries or ice bridges, but this is a rather slow one-way trip. No land units of any type belonging to any power can ever cross the river west to east. Going east to west, each ferry can carry 1 infantry or 1 supply, while each ice bridge can support 1 unit of any type or a supply token. Any Soviet unit can brave the river crossing on an ice bridge, but they can only ever send 1 unit or supply out at a time on each crossing. Moving onto the river is the full movement of the unit or supply token, meaning that they're going to have to spend a turn on the water. If they start their movement phase on the Volga, they must offload into the corresponding zone on the west side of the river. Supply tokens can't move beyond that zone, but coming off the river is a free move for a land unit. So if that zone is friendly, they can move again. If that zone is hostile, they will engage in combat as normal. Simple enough, right? Well, the Germans might have something to say about it, so don't forget to look up. As part of their movement phase, the Germans can move air units to the various river crossings to attack ferries, units, and/or supply tokens that are trying to cross them. However, each crossing is a separate target, and each air unit can only attack 1 crossing at a time. Also, the Germans may target ferries whether or not they're currently carrying cargo. On to our 4th card, Allies Reaction. Here, the Soviets have 2 first strike abilities to resolve, air defense and ambushers. Let's start with air defense. First, an important note here about air defense. This ability works differently on the region board versus the city board. You'll see why, and it makes perfect sense, but the difference is easy to overlook while you're playing, so keep an eye out for this one. In this phase, Soviet artillery on the region board may fire at enemy air units that have moved into the zone that they are in during Phase 3. The Soviets will roll 1 die for each artillery in the zone. So if they've got 4 artillery, they're rolling 4 dice, scoring a hit for each 1 that they roll. For each hit scored, the German player must choose an air unit in that zone, along with any cargo it might have been carrying, to destroy immediately and remove from the board. Air units taken down this way, of course, won't be doing any firing as they've already been shot down. Artillery on the city board work basically the same way with 2 big exceptions. First, accounting for the scale difference between the 2 maps, each artillery unit on the city board can fire at 1 enemy air unit anywhere on the city board, including those that might be attacking Soviet units crossing the Volga River. However, if the reacting player has multiple artillery in the city, all the targets must be assigned before any dice are rolled, which takes us to our second difference. Artillery units crossing the Volga River may not use their air ability. More on this when we get to combat rules in a minute. After all the air defenses have been resolved, the ambushers get to do their thing. Let's talk about ambush sites. These are essentially snipers' nests, and they're very hard to neutralize. There are 5 ambush sites, and they're all on the city board. Here's how they work. They aren't in any single zone. Instead, ambush sites occupy the junction of borders between 3 or 4 zones. As such, they are adjacent to all those zones, but they aren't zones themselves. So supply lines cannot be routed through them. During their movement phase, 1 and only 1 infantry unit may enter an unoccupied ambush zone from an adjacent uncontested zone. Once they're inside, they cannot be attacked directly, and they're always considered to be supplied. If an infantry wishes to leave an ambush site, they can exit into an adjacent zone as long as it's been friendly and uncontested since the beginning of that side's movement phase. The only way to forcibly remove an enemy infantry from an ambush site is to control all the zones connected to it. Those zones can be contested, but the moment all of the adjacent zones are controlled, the guy in the ambush site is done. Remove the infantry unit, and now that ambush site is free to go home. So now that we know what they are, back to the card. Allied ambushers fire. Here's what that means. The Soviet player will select a zone adjacent to their hidey hole and roll 1 die, looking to snipe an enemy land unit. If they roll a 2, a hit is scored, and the defending player removes a casualty of their choosing. If the Soviets roll a 1, they score a hit, and they choose the casualty themselves. Looking at the map, we can see zones flanked by more than 1 ambush site. If these are occupied by the same power, they can target the same zone on the same turn. However, because there's a possibility of a targeted attack, these should always be rolled 1 at a time. And unlike the air defense ability of the artillery units, ambushers don't have to declare which zone they're firing into until just before they roll. So they can adjust their targets based on the success or failure of other ambush sites. And enemy units pop this way, don't know what hit them, they're removed immediately. Card number 5 is a big one, Axis attack. Now, the first thing on here is relocating air units land, and all air transport cargo is offloaded. So let's do the first thing first. As advertised, planes that were relocating or carrying cargo either land or drop off their stuff. Next, we resolve any Axis air attacks on the units crossing the Volga. For each crossing, roll 1 die for each attacking air unit. They will score a hit on the roll of a 3 or less as normal. If any of those attacking air units score a hit, the ferry and its cargo are destroyed. If the river is frozen, the unit or supply token on the ice bridge is destroyed. 2 really important things to keep in mind here. First, no units of any type can ever fire while crossing the Volga. Second, ice bridges are never destroyed. For the purposes of combat, as long as a ferry or ice bridge is present, the units in the corresponding land zones are always considered supplied, even if the Axis control it. Meaning that once the Volga River freezes, these supply lines crossing the river become permanent, but they still only service their respective sectors through friendly zones. Once all the attacks on the Volga River crossings have been resolved, it's time for general combat. The attacking player, in this case the Axis, will get to choose the order that the battles are resolved, and this order is going to be very important. As each battle is resolved, the paths for supply lines must be reassessed. Each battle may cause 1 or more zones to gain or lose access to supplies, so choose carefully. Remember this supply line example from earlier? The Soviets are attacking Barricada Factory, but the bread factory and the tractor factory are unsupplied because Barricada Factory is controlled by the Axis. If the Soviets resolve the battle in Barricada Factory first and successfully take control of the zone, that will give the guys in the bread factory and tractor factory a viable supply line over the Gray Ferry. Meaning, when they start the fight in the bread factory, those Soviet units will have the beans and bullets they need to fight at full strength. Each combat is going to consist of 1 round of the following steps. Place units on the battle board, attacking units fire, defending units fire, remove defender casualties, return units to the game board, and conclude combat. This game comes with a fantastic battle board to help speed up gameplay. So as we place the units on the battle board, we can see it has attackers and defenders on opposite sides in columns based on their attack or defense values. Attacking infantry that are supplied have an attack value of 1, so they go in the 1 column. Supplied attacking artillery units go into the 2 column, and so on. Do the same for the defending units. There are a few modifiers on here that we need to talk about. If attacking land units are unsupplied, they get a -1 to their attack value, and so they get placed in the appropriate column on the unsupplied row. That will mean that attacking infantry and mechanized infantry end up in the 0 column. If there's bad weather in this round, all air units are also going to be in the 0 column because they cannot attack or defend. Obviously, these units aren't going to be rolling any dice, but they can be selected as casualties. Soviet rocket launchers will always go in the 0 column on the battle board when attacking or defending because they don't fire in this part of the turn. We'll talk about them in a bit. In addition to a possible modification based on their supply status and weather conditions, defending units get a +1 bonus if they're defending a fortified zone. Fortified zones are the ones with the pillbox icon on them. There's only 1 on the region board and 6 on the city board. Defending units that are being attacked from across an unfrozen river also get a +1 to their defense value, but these modifiers don't stack. Defending units can never get more than +1 to their defense value. However, keep in mind that that +1 bonus can be offset if the zone is unsupplied. In that case, land units would be placed on the battle board in the supplied column to show the balance. Now, you can skip this step if the attack includes land units moving into a zone that is unoccupied, or if the zone only has an airfield with fighters and bombers that can't fight due to bad weather. There's no need to roll here. The zone is immediately captured and all the air units are immediately destroyed, so watch these carefully. Once you've got all the units on the battle board, it is time for step 2, attackers fire. Now, this isn't exactly what the rulebook says, but to keep from forgetting, I like to roll all of the units with special abilities first. In this game, that would be attacking bombers and attacking or defending assault guns and fighters. These all have targeted abilities that mean that they need to be rolled separately. Now, this is easy to overlook in the heat of battle, so I recommend getting in the habit of looking for and rolling all of these units first. Once the special abilities have been rolled, the attacking player rolls 1 die for each remaining unit in a column, 1 column at a time. So roll all the 1s, note the number of hits, roll all the 2s, and so on. After all the attacking units have been rolled, the defending player must assign 1 hit to each of their units for each hit scored. Unless those hits have come from units with a targeted fire ability, the defender will be allowed to assign those hits as they see fit and move those units to the casualty zone. Not off the board, they will get to fire back. Real quick, let's talk about targeted abilities. Attacking bombers that score a hit may force the defender to assign that hit to a type of land unit. The attacker names a unit type. Then the defender has to select a unit of that type to move to the casualty zone. While attacking or defending, fighters may target air units with their hits, forcing the opponent to select an air unit as the casualty. Lastly, the assault gun may target Soviet tanks with their hits, forcing the Soviets to assign assault gun hits to a tank, if they have one. If no tank is present, the hit is assigned by the opponent as normal. Okay, after all the attacking units have fired and casualties have been assigned, it's time for step 3, defending units fire. Just as before, I'd like to look for any units with targeted abilities. On the defense, that would be assault guns and fighters, and then roll them first. Then, just like the attackers, the defenders roll 1 die for each unit in a column, 1 column at a time, noting hits along the way. After all the dice have been rolled and the smoke clears, targeted hits are assigned as needed along with any general hits. These units are removed from the battle board immediately and returned to the attacking player's supply. Time to clean up the battlefield. Step 4, the defender removes units from the casualty zone. Once any surviving units are back on the map, we need to conclude combat. First, if there are still units belonging to both sides, if needed, flip that combat marker from assault to battle and move on to the next combat. If only Soviet units remain, remove the combat marker and any German control markers. If only Axis units remain, remove the combat marker and place a German control marker. If control of the zone has changed, the new controller captures any enemy-owned supply tokens that are in the zone. Just flip them over to show the new owner. Also, any air units in the zone belonging to the side that lost control that are on the ground are destroyed and returned to their own unit pool. One important note here. Earlier I said that there's no need to roll when attacking a zone with an air base with fighters and bombers grounded in bad weather because they're immediately destroyed. And that's true, but this is not the case if the zone under attack is defended by land units that don't have an attack value, like, say, rocket launchers. These units are not insta-killed. The Soviets get a little bit of an edge here because, remember, combat only lasts 1 round. So even though the defenders might not fire back, the attackers still have to roll enough hits to destroy all the occupying land units to capture the zone. If they fail to do that, the zone remains contested. So that is combat in Axis and Allies Stalingrad. I know that we are only on card 5, but as you can imagine, almost all of what we've covered so far is also going to be true when it's the Allies' turn to move and attack. There are still a few fun pieces to go over, but it'll go much faster from here. Card number 6, Axis air units land. The card tells you basically everything that you need to know. Air units that survived combat or performed a supply drop need to land in a zone with an airbase that they've controlled since before they started moving. Remember, each airbase can only hold up to 4 air units, and that bombers that moved in infantry via air transport are grounded for the rest of the turn. See? Easy. Card number 7, Allies Counteroffensive. When this card comes up in rounds 1 and 2, just discard it. It's only in play from rounds 3 through 7. This is the part of the show where the Soviets either continue to prepare for or launch Operation Uranus. Starting on round 3, the Soviet player draws 2 cards from the Operation Uranus deck, looks at them secretly, places one face down in the northwest and the other face down in the southeast. These are top secret classified information, so the Axis player may not look at them, but the Soviets can review them at any time. In rounds 3 through 6, after placing their cards, the Soviets may choose to announce the launch of Operation Uranus. If this is round 7, no more waiting, they must launch. When Operation Uranus begins, the units on the card are immediately deployed on the region board based on the round in which the counteroffensive is launched and where the card was placed when drawn. The units on the cards in the north must be deployed in the north. The units on the card in the southeast must be deployed in the southeast. Now, these units will move into zones labeled with the round number that Operation Uranus was launched or lower. So if the Allies choose to launch Operation Uranus in round 4, they may only deploy units into the territory marked 3+. If they launch on round 6, they can deploy units into both 3+ and 5+ zones. If they launch on round 7, they can deploy units into the zones marked 3, 5, and or 7. The units on each card must be deployed together into the same zone, and no more than 2 cards units may be deployed into the same zone. Any air units deployed this way are considered to be in the air and can move and attack as normal, but they will need to find an air base with room for them when the time comes to land. If the Soviets have land units guarding these deployment zones, overstacking might occur as the land units are deployed. That's okay. Stacking limits aren't enforced until after they move. Remember, air units don't count towards stacking limits. However, if these zones are enemy occupied when reinforcements enter, this constitutes an assault and they won't be allowed to move until that battle's resolved. Sensing a strategy here. Anyway. Once Operation Uranus is launched and the units have been placed, put order card number 7 and all the Operation Uranus cards back in the box. You are done with those for this game. Now, this key moment in the game also sets the clock on the Axis response. Place the Operation Winter Storm marker on the round tracker for 3 rounds from now. This is mentioned on order card number 2, but when Operation Winter Storm round is reached, in addition to their freebie depending on the odd-even round number, the Axis also receive a free air unit of their choice. More importantly, they can start spending all those RPCs that they've been squirreling away, and they can deploy all those new units to Sermosin and or Verkhnekhamsky. Now, just as with Operation Uranus, they can overstack those zones until the end of their movement phase. If they deploy into an enemy-occupied zone, they're going to have to fight through it, etc. Card number 8, Historic Workers of Stalingrad. This one is pretty straightforward. On odd-numbered rounds, the Soviets get a free tank in their tank factory. On even-numbered rounds, the artillery factor churns out an artillery unit. If a factory is captured by the Axis, turn the token over and they don't produce anything. Now, if one factory is captured, it can be liberated and restored to operation by capturing the zone that factory is in. However, if at any point both factories are controlled by the Axis, it's all bad. Both factories are completely destroyed. Remove them from the map permanently. Card number 9, Allies Reinforcement. Moving right along. Here, the Allies total the value of the RPs from zones that they control and collect that amount of RPCs. Unlike the invading Axis powers, the Soviets don't have to occupy the zones to collect the revenue, and zones generate RPs even if they are contested. Then, using the player reference chart, the Allies may save or immediately spend their RPCs on reinforcements and then deploy the requisitioned units and or tokens immediately. Requisition materials must always be deployed into Venetskaya, Ilanovska, Krasnoarmeysk, and or Krasnaya Sloboda, and may be deployed into those zones even if they are enemy-controlled. Alternatively, supply tokens may be deployed into zones containing friendly airfields. A big important note here. Soviet deployment to zones on the region map that happen during this phase are limited to 1 unit per zone unless that zone is Axis occupied. Keyword there is occupied. It doesn't matter who controls the zone. In this case, there's no limit to the number of units that the Allied player can deploy into that zone. Now, deployments in Krasnaya Sloboda never have a limit, but that zone does have the same stacking limits as every other zone. Now, just like the other operations that we talked about, deploying units can violate the stacking limit until the end of their next movement phase, and if they deploy into an Axis-controlled zone, it's going to be a fight. Card number 10, Allies Movement. This works exactly the same as the Axis movement in every round except for rounds 1 and 2. In his infinite wisdom, Stalin gave order number 227. This genius decision forbade any unit from retreating in the face of the enemy. To reflect that in the game, during rounds 1 and 2 only, Allied land units adjacent to Axis units may only move into hostile or contested adjacent zones or hold their position. They may not utilize additional movement points to enter combat further away. And remember that some zones on the city map are directly adjacent to region map zones. A little insult to injury here. Allied land units in the city can't leave the board for the first 2 rounds. Meaning, if there are Axis units in Viertiachi at this point in round 1, the Soviets in the adjacent Arlovka can't leave the city to assault Viertiachi, nor can they move away from the enemy-controlled zone. So, needless to say, the Soviets' movement options for the first 2 rounds are going to be a bit hamstrung. And at the end of the Soviets' movement phase, remember to check the stacking limits and resolve any violations in the way that we talked about earlier. Card number 11, Axis Reaction. After the Allies move, the Axis get to react. Just as with the Allies, the Axis get to roll for air defense and any ambush sites that they control, immediately removing any casualties. Card number 12, Allies Attack. Now it's time for the Allies to do their thing. Again, this works basically the same as it did for the Axis, but the Soviets brought rocket launchers to the party. These are pretty cool, but first, the drawbacks. The rocket launcher never has a true attack or defense value. That means it can only move into zones that have been friendly since the start of the Allies' movement phase. So they can't capture any zones. It also means that if they're in a zone that comes under attack, all that it can do is take a hit. But here's why they're cool. After the Soviets land any relocating air units and bombers drop off anything that they were hauling around, rocket launchers use their bombardment ability. This ability resolves before the normal combat that we saw from the Axis earlier. To use this ability, the zone with the rocket launcher must be supplied and it must be uncontested. These things are volatile. If that's the case, when on the region map, the rocket launcher can fire into any adjacent zone. When on the city map, they can fire into any other zone in the city. The zone being bombarded cannot be the zone that the rocket launcher is in. That would be bad. It also can't be a contested zone unless that zone is currently being assaulted, aka attacked for the first time, just like the bombers. Each rocket launcher can only fire once in each Allied attack phase. So if multiple eligible zones are being fired upon by different rocket launchers, each one of them has to be assigned to target a single zone before any dice are rolled. When a zone is targeted for bombardment, roll 1 die for each launcher. Each roll of a 1 scores a hit. For every hit scored, the Axis player must select and immediately remove 1 unit from the targeted zone. These units are immediately destroyed and will not take part in the upcoming combat. Once all the rockets have red glared and any casualties have been removed, the Soviets get down to business and conduct 1 round of combat in the same way that we described earlier. When the Soviet combat is complete, we turn our attention to card number 13. Soviet fighters and any bombers who made supply drops need to find a place to land while respecting the max of 4 air units per base. That brings us to the end of the round, and it is time to check for victory. Do the Axis have control of all of the RP zones in the city and a supply line into at least one of them? Do the Allies control or contest all zones west of the Don River, plus Potomnik, Rhinoc, and Viertiachi? Probably not. If not, move the round tracker to the next round, refresh your trusty order cards, and start another round of madness. If that is the end of the 13th round, that is the game. Check for a major or minor victory based on the conditions we discussed earlier, and that can be found on page 6 of the rulebook. Once you've got a few games under your belt, I recommend trying out the optional rules on page 28 of the rulebook and on the optional rules cards. Many of these rules introduce some interesting strategic variations and some additional historical flavor. Thank you for watching the Board Game Nation How to Play video for Axis and Allies Stalingrad. If you've got questions, feel free to drop them in the comments below and we'll do our best to answer them as quickly as possible. Thank you to our friends at Renegade Game Studios for sponsoring this video. And of course, a big, giant, huge thank you to the citizens of Board Game Nation for their continued support. We could not do this without you. If you'd like to support the craziness that we're doing here, get loads of exclusive content, and engage with our fantastic community, click that join button, find the membership level that's right for you, and become an official citizen of Board Game Nation. To check out our other Axis and Allies content, here you go. For our latest bit of mayhem, right this way. And if you're ready for more from Board Game Nation, click here to subscribe. My name is Gary Blevins. This is Board Game Nation. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next time.